Is Spock correct that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one? I'm Cody Leibel. Welcome to our Patreon Hangout, and this is April 20th, 2019. So we took Spock as our inspiration for this question of individualism versus collectivism. The needs of the many, the needs of the few. Here is a quote from my friend Rowan Murphy. He says, "A society is nothing without the individuals of which it is composed. Any society that purports to cherish the many over the few is lying to itself. For if you do not protect the individual, then you have a society composed of many who are oppressed. For a society to be a good one, it needs to protect the individual above all." So individualism, collectivism, how do we as Christians engage with these ideas? Is it true that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few? Is there something wrong with the way that question is posed? Is it maybe not a precisely framed question? It raises a lot of questions when I hear that question. Provokes thought. So who is the one that gets to decide what weighs what? What is the standard of measurement? Are we all playing God in some sense? Are we trying to decide the fate of other people? Now, we need to acknowledge that there are contexts where it is necessary and it is appropriate for men to play judge. For instance, if you were to think about the example of a ship captain, especially if you're a military captain, like what if you're the captain of the Starship Enterprise? Should you play judge and send somebody else, send the red shirt to his death or to danger in order to protect the crew? Well, that's what you have to do if you're in the military, to stop disaster. And from such cases like firefighters, soldiers, these kinds of policemen, we get this kind of thing called the lifeboat problem. It's a moral thought experiment that asks you, what would you do morally if you were stuck on a boat? And you may hear the catchphrase, we're all in the same boat. That's actually a collectivist catchphrase. Typically, you would hear somebody saying that when they want to declare what kind of sacrifice everybody's going to have to make in order to pay for his chosen goal. But is it ever true in some sense that the needs of the many do outweigh the needs of the few? Well, certainly in some sense. The ship captain, the firefighter, the soldier, they have to think in such terms on occasion because their work involves handling emergencies. And that's what they all have in common. In an emergency situation, the priority for all people involved is to get out of the emergency situation. So you might be put into a position where you have to save only one group or another. And typically it's going to be morally praiseworthy if you have to choose one person versus 7 people to go save the 7. Now, collectivists and statists are trying to apply that paradigm beyond its appropriate realm. They're trying to apply that paradigm to society under normal circumstances. And you can see what the problem would be with doing something like that. You can see where that would lead. If you treat all of society as if it is a lifeboat problem, then you get to play God. You get to play judge. So for example, what if there are poor people? What if we need to solve the problem of poverty? Well, I am treating the United States as a lifeboat, and I'm going to take your wealth and I'm going to give it to this person. That's the kind of thing that you see. So in a welfare state, in a collectivist government policy, we see that power is given to the president or to the Congress, power like that ship captain of the Starship Enterprise. And that's where the analogy breaks down. That's where it's not right. Because emergency situations, the goal is to put the end to the emergency, but human life as such is not an emergency. Collectivism says we are all in one boat, even when we aren't all on one boat. And it's the view that says the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And from this point forward, I will be the judge of who needs what and who has to pay what to whom. You can see how this goes. So unlike the volunteer soldier, sailor, firefighter, the citizen living in a collectivistic society is permanently and involuntarily burdened with unchosen duties to his society. He must pay a progressive income tax, not because he chose to participate in some project and then he counted the cost and he volunteered, but rather because taxes are the price that we pay to live in a civilized society, as you may have heard. Under collectivism, there is no room for the idea that civilization is a process of setting men free from men, that civilization is the progress toward a society of privacy, which is an idea that I agree with. It was advocated by Ayn Rand, and Jacob and I both agree with it. Under collectivism, the group is treated as the entity of main importance. It's the group that is more important than the individuals that compose it. Primacy is given to the collective. In the strong expressions of such systems, individuals are treated as cogs in a machine. What matters most is that the individual cogs contribute to the working of the machine. It's not the cogs really that matter. It's the function of the whole machine. Now, if a single cog breaks or if a single cog needs to be sacrificed, that's fine, because what matters is the machine. That's a collectivistic approach strongly expressed. We are discussing collectivism today, and we will be focusing on strong, consistent applications of the principle of collectivism. Strong collectivism like Soviet Russia, Maoist China, Nazi Germany, ancient Egypt, present-day Venezuela. To the extent that collectivism is applied with something that you could call consistency, it results in one thing. It results in death. Intellectuals ought to care about collectivism because it's destroying the world today. But do they? Do they care? It seems like this pattern, this cause and effect, collectivism leading to death, is a trend that the intellectuals would want to study. But it is a truth that most intellectuals do not want to understand. And so Jacob and I are working really hard to make it so that it's harder for them to remain blind, and it's more costly for them to remain blind until there comes a day when new Christian intellectuals will dominate. And the old intellectuals are going to feel the need to compromise with us, not with Karl Marx and with his ideological offspring. Jacob, can you talk a little bit about thinking in principle and how that is going to play into this discussion?
Yeah, it's a really important part of the discussion because oftentimes when we're talking about collectivism and individualism, a lot of the knee-jerk response, especially from conservative Christians even, is often, well, isn't there some sort of middle ground? Can't we kind of have a what you might call a Goldilocks option, where we don't go to either extreme. We don't want to be too extreme. So let's try to find safety in the middle. And what I want to ask is, are there any moral absolutes when it comes to how we ought to live our lives on this earth? And especially when it comes to how we ought to interact with other people in society, or how society ought to treat individuals. Are there any moral absolutes? And I think too often when we try to find a middle ground on issues like this, we're implicitly denying the idea that there are moral absolutes on these types of questions. We're sort of implicitly relying on this idea that really we're just operating off of whatever works best, a sort of very pragmatic, range of the moment, utilitarian type mindset that doesn't think that there are moral absolutes at play here. And I want to just encourage us as Christians to be consistent. We talk about moral absolutes in some areas of life and in some areas of society, but then we drop that language when it comes to things that are a little bit more difficult to talk about. And I would just challenge us, let's be consistent with that. And then in addition to that, we're going to be talking about what does it look like to take this idea seriously, take collectivism to its logical conclusion. And if you want to push back against that and say, yeah, but no one today is calling for full out Marxism, or no one today, even conservatives who want a little bit of collectivism, they're not going to turn into Marx tomorrow. That's true, they're not. But we don't think like that when we address theological problems, right? If someone's bringing in an idea in theology that will work itself out eventually in false teaching, in denying the gospel, most conservative Christians are quick to identify that and say, hey, you may not be denying the gospel right now, but if you take this line of reasoning seriously, it will result in denying the gospel. We need to be prepared to think in that same way about social issues and about moral issues. And that's what we're trying to advocate for when we talk about collectivism and individualism. We're saying, just like with theological ideas, a little bit of leaven leavens the whole lump. Just like with theological ideas work themselves out in society to their logical conclusions in due time. And we're trying to prevent these bad ideas from getting a foothold before they work themselves out to their logical conclusions of mass death, mass poverty, mass suffering.
So it matters that we're willing to think about the most extreme and consistent version of the principle in question. And once we understand where that application of that principle would lead, then we can understand where the partial application of a principle leads. So partial application of collectivism, we see that in societies such as Great Britain and the United States. They were once relatively free economically. They've compromised the principle of economic liberty in order to partially replace it. Now that we have collectivized science, we have collectivized art, collectivized schooling, housing, healthcare, more and more the government takes the position of playing judge, playing God, like a military general, deciding who's going to be the winner and who's going to be sacrificed for the good of the collective. To the extent that such societies operate on collectivism, we see rising costs, diminishing production, diminishing innovation, lower quality, less variety of options, longer lines, less chance to keep your doctor, and all of this for the mere cost of higher taxes, making every experience into a DMV experience. The Department of Motor Vehicles is the archetypical example of the quality of service that comes to those living in collectivized societies. So ask yourself this question: how much of your society do you want to look like the DMV? That is what collectivizing does. To the extent that you apply the principle, you get the fruit. So we're looking at the principle of collectivism. We're looking at the principle that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And we're looking at it as a principle, as its full implementation, or as its partial implementation to the extent. All right, so no Goldilocks compromises. No. What else do we need to point out, Jacob?
So we need to just kind of help to define what we mean by collectivism and individualism. I mean, we've given a lot of good examples that I think paint a good picture, but I think it's important and helpful to have a little bit of a systematic understanding of what we're talking about here, because there are some gray lines or gray areas where people might get confused. By collectivism, we mean the idea that the society or the group has priority over the individuals. And by individualism, we mean basically the opposite, that the individual has priority over the group. And our argument for individualism is rooted in the fact that the individual just is metaphysically prior to the group. Think about it. When you have a group, you have to answer a group of what? What are you talking about? A group of pieces of dirt? A group of ants? A group of trees? A group of human beings? And in society, we're talking about a group of human beings. And human beings are individual beings. Not that I don't live in society, I do. But what we mean by that, metaphysically speaking, is that my existence isn't contingent upon the existence of other people or on society as such. It's contingent upon God, absolutely. And so God is metaphysically prior to the individual human, but the individual human is metaphysically prior to society. The society is built up of, made up of individual human beings. And so just metaphysically speaking, individuals come before the group. And then you've got to address the issue of, well, how is the group composed? You can say the same thing about a beehive. A beehive is composed of individual bees, and you can't talk about the hive apart from understanding what it's a hive of. It's a hive of bees, not a hive of crickets or whatever else. There's that instance of what is it composed of, but then there's also the question of how are the things composed? How are they grouped together? How are they collected? What's doing the collecting? When we're talking about collectives of human beings, are we talking about people who are just arbitrarily selected from all parts of the world? Are we talking about people who have something specific in common? And in a society, typically, what we're talking about is people who have certain fundamental ideas and values in common. And that's why they're part of a certain shared governmental structure, especially when we're talking about government. Having ideas and values in common, having that be the uniting factor, means that each individual's consent to those ideas and values, each individual's approval of those ideas and values is necessary for the functioning of the collective, of the society. The second a individual removes his assent to those ideas, he's functionally removing himself from that collective, from that group. And if everybody did that, if everybody disagreed with whatever that idea was, there would be no society or no group to speak of.
All right, so Jacob, we talked about what they are, individualism and collectivism, the metaphysical primacy issue. We talked about why we have to choose one of these as a moral absolute, and you can't really compromise. So let's talk about this position of individualism as a theory of society and government. Does this arise in a vacuum, or is this built on something else?
No, I think fundamentally it's built on, because it's a moral concept. We're talking about moral absolutes here, right? And so I think fundamentally it's built on a prior moral principle that there are moral absolutes for how one ought to live his life before God. Even if society didn't exist, there is a right and a wrong way for me to live my life before God on this earth. And I've got an obligation to live in that way. And then once other people are brought into the picture, the details of that might change, but the fundamental principle that I owe my life to God, I owe moral obedience to God, doesn't change. And so fundamentally, individualism is just rooted in the fact that each one of us is responsible to God for our own lives, for all of our lives, for the way that we use our minds to think about his reality, to process his revelation, and to avoid error, to discover truth, the way that we build our character to be oriented toward the good, the true, and the beautiful, and to be repulsed, ideally, by the sinful, the evil, the ugly, and the way that we act in our lives in this world to build things, to build careers, to build a quote-unquote name for the kingdom of heaven, the way that we live out our entire lives and our entire vocation. All of that is owed to God individually. It's between me and God. The fact that there are other people around adds certain variables to that, but it doesn't change the fundamental aspect or the fundamental fact that ultimately my moral duty is to God, not to other people. And this is similar to a very Protestant doctrine of the priesthood of all believers. It's this idea that I don't need human mediators between me and God. In fact, I dare not place human mediators between myself and God. And that goes epistemologically in terms of knowing the truth of God, but it also goes for ethically in the way that I live my life. I dare not place other people between myself and God, as they are the people that they are the only way or the primary way that I serve God. No, the primary way I serve God is through my relationship with him individually, and that is going to work itself out in lots of service to other people. But my individual service to God is the primary, it's the first, and other people are an outflow of that, not something in between me and God.
That's very clarifying, and it reminds me of that passage, "Against you and you only have I sinned," from David.
Yeah.
So also, we need a moral philosophy. The idea of how you handle your social philosophy and your political philosophy has to be based on a moral philosophy. So let's talk about that. What is the moral philosophy, rational egoism, that we are promoting as the proper foundation for individualism?
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, I just described rational egoism without using the term. What we mean by rational egoism is rational self-interest. Egoism means self-interest. And the rational means in accordance with reality. So we're not talking about whim worship here. We're not talking about satisfying your immediate desires. We're not talking about subjective preferences. We're talking about orienting your mind to understand all of reality as much as you're able to do, including especially the reality of God and the fact that God is the creator of this world, taking all of reality into account as much as is possible, and then acting in your own self-interest based on that. You can't get around that. You know, the fact that everyone does what's in their own best self-interest. That's psychological egoism. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you can't obey God apart from yourself, apart from you being you. There is no other self through whom to act in your obedience to God. There is no other mind that you have control over to understand the truth of God. There is no other body that you have control over to act in this world in order to obey God. You have direct control solely over your own mind, your own values, your own body, and your own life. Your life is the domain in which you are responsible for glorifying God, and you're responsible for glorifying God in all of it. If you don't value your own life, your own mind, you're not going to take care of it in order to steward it properly. So in a way, this is sort of a sub-doctrine of the idea of stewardship, of Christian stewardship. God has given you this life, and you're a steward of it. And it's the most fundamental thing that you have to be steward over. Everything else that you have to be steward over is derivative of this one fundamental thing that you're steward over, namely yourself. And to neglect that, to devalue it, is going to cause major moral shipwreck in the long run. And so, yes, this doctrine of individualism, of Christian individualism, is rooted in a doctrine of Christian rational self-interest. But a way to think about it is just Christian stewardship over your own life.
In the previous Patron Hangout video we did, we talked about, is Jesus an altruist? And so we have these, let me just give you guys a little bit of a introduction to the philosophical framework that we're working from. I mean, we've talked about a lot of terms here, and so let's try to interrelate those terms, because otherwise you can get lost in the weeds. But a philosophy consists of a metaphysics and epistemology, and then a theory of morality, and a theory of society and politics. So one way of approaching your epistemology could be blind faith or anti-reason, and the opposite of that would be rationality or objectivity. And then when it comes to the next level, on the moral philosophy, one way of approaching it is altruism, and another is egoism. And we see those as the fundamental alternatives that have been presented today. And then you go to the next level down to your theory of society, and your alternatives are collectivism or individualism. And you go to the level of government and law, and your alternatives are welfare statism, or just statism in general, versus individual rights. So you can see how all these fit together. That's how we view the intellectual landscape. That's not necessarily how other people, like a leftist or even a traditionalist conservative, would view the ideological landscape. But we thought it would be helpful to get that out there, that we believe that the view that we're advocating, individualism and individual rights, rests on rational self-interest as a moral code. And that rests on rationality and objectivity as an epistemological approach. So we think they're all connected, and we thought it would be really helpful for you to see how they're all connected.
Yeah. This all works itself out in the rest of life, and we see the examples of it all around us. Whenever someone refuses to think for themselves and relies on sort of blind tradition or the opinions of experts, maybe relies blindly on the PhD status that somebody might have, if you've been following recent social media interchanges, whenever someone does anything epistemologically that abnegates their own responsibility to think for themselves, they are sort of functionally being a collectivist epistemologically. It's a second-handedness that shirks off one's own responsibility before God for one's own beliefs and uses the excuse of others believing certain things to cover up the fact that one has abandoned one's own responsibility before God. So that's epistemologically. And then morally, it works itself out in similar ways in terms of thinking, if I guard my own values, then I'm being selfish. I'm not thinking of quote unquote others. And so maybe I have to sacrifice what I believe is the right thing to do in this situation for the sake of what other people think is the right thing to do in this situation. And that's why a lot of people, good, well-intentioned people, end up morally compromising, because they haven't been taught that it's okay. And not even that it's okay, that it's a good thing, it's a righteous thing to stand up for your own convictions, for your own principles, for what you believe is morally right and morally wrong. They've been taught to think that moral compromise is the good, the loving thing to do. And that's what most people mean by being loving today. They mean being morally compromising. And so that's the way it works out morally. And then in everyday life, what we were just talking about in terms of wanting to sort of try to find a middle ground in public policy, compromising between good and evil, that's another way of failing to stand up for what you know to be right, and taking a stand and having the courage to do what you are convicted that God has called you to do.
Jacob, lately on social media, you've been teased for being a Brovenist and a Theobrogen. And it's hilarious because that's exactly the kind of critique that we would expect, because you're advocating for rational egoism. You're calling God a divine egoist, and you're Calvinist. And you're also assertive and asserting your own values in a way that it reminds me of how the people were amazed because he taught as one having authority and not as the teachers at TGC.
That's a really good paraphrase. And I don't want to compare myself to Christ here in too much of a blasphemous sense. But there is a sense in which we are Christians. We are little Christ. We are to emulate him as much as is appropriate. And I think there's a lot more that is appropriate to emulate in the way that Jesus taught and the way that Jesus handled public false teaching than what many Christians today are comfortable with. And I think it's appropriate, especially for men, to try to emulate the way that Jesus handled these types of things.
So let's talk about Jesus as the paradigm of collectivism. You've probably heard the high priest Caiaphas. He tried to say something about it would be expedient that one man should die for the people in John 18. And in John 11, you've got the full quote. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. And not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So when the high priest said that, it was actually God saying it through him. And it was true. It was just not true in the sense that the high priest understood it. So now that's really cool. But you need to look at that and ask, is that a paradigm of collectivism? It really sounds like it. It almost sounds like Spock, the needs of the many and the needs of the few, right? This idea of sacrificing the one for the many. Keep in mind that it was in the mouth of a villain. But some people have taken it as a model for Christian morality and social theory. God valued the many over the one. Blasphemy. That is absolutely not true. God does not value humanity over the life of Jesus.
Yeah. Who is the one here? We're talking about Christ. Don't you dare claim that God valued sinful humanity over his son. Cody said it. It needs to be said a lot stronger. That is blasphemy. That is disgusting. And the proof that that's not the case is what we're going to celebrate tomorrow on Easter Sunday, that Jesus rose from the dead. His death wasn't an end in itself. It had a purpose, and he had a purpose in it. He was looking to the reward. He went for the joy set before him. What was that joy? That he would be marveled at and glorified among all who have believed. God and Jesus designed this apparent instance of collectivism for ends that are truly not collectivism at all. They're truly very individualistic and egoistic on God's part in terms of seeking his own values. And it involved saving many, thankfully for us, but that wasn't the end goal. That wasn't the ultimate end. The ultimate end was his own glory and the glory that he was going to have from the redeemed who would marvel at him now for his grace.
He went to the cross despising the shame. He did it for the sake of the joy set before him, Hebrews 12:2 says. And Philippians 2:9-11 says, wherefore God also hath highly exalted him and given him a name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of things in heaven and things in earth and things under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Doesn't sound like he was putting the needs of the many above his own rational seeking of values. And it doesn't sound like he believed that needs constitute a claim. Let's talk about that one, Jacob. This plays into collectivism. There's this idea that's very common in culture today, that a need of one person constitutes a moral claim against somebody else. Tell me what you think of that.
Yeah, so and often it's framed in a collectivistic way in terms of the needs of many, like the Spock quote, constituting a claim on the needs of those who are able to fill it. And the idea is, and this is a theory of justice, the idea is that if you are in need, you deserve for those who are able to fill that need to fulfill it. You have a just claim against. So if I am in need of $100 and you've got an excess $100, and the way that we define excess is going to be dubious here, but let's just put it in scare quotes. If I need $100, and that's also potentially in scare quotes, and you have an excess of $100, then I have a just claim against you for that $100, and justice consists of you giving me that $100. Politically, that works itself out, obviously, in things like welfare and the state forcefully taking that $100 from you and giving it to me. But some people, a lot of Christians today, would say that they advocate for that theory of justice, but they don't want the government to get involved. But there's still a problem with it. And the problem is what I've talked about in many articles and in the debate that I recently participated in. The problem is that this idea of justice contradicts the justice of God in the gospel. Because the justice of God in the gospel says that you deserve wrath, but you don't need wrath, right? I need God to be nice to me. I don't need him to punish me in hell forever. And yet he is going to not give me what I need, and he's going to punish me in hell forever and call that justice if I don't repent. So if justice means giving you what you need, then God is unjust in the gospel, because God refuses to give us what we need as justice. He will give us what we need as mercy, as long as we recognize that we don't deserve it, that we don't have a just claim against him. And so this idea of justice as a need constitutes a right would mean that we have a right to God's grace. It would mean that we have a right to go to heaven. It would mean that God is unjust in not admitting every sinner to heaven apart from the work of Christ on the cross. It makes the work of Christ on the cross obsolete. It makes Good Friday obsolete. It makes Easter obsolete, everything that we're celebrating this weekend. And it turns God into a moral monster. It makes God an evil, stingy, greedy, unjust, rich tyrant who refuses to share what he has with those in need. That's the picture of God in the gospel, as he says, you don't deserve this. I'm only giving it to you out of my free mercy, not because you deserve it, not because you need it, not because you have a just claim to it. You don't have a just claim to it. You must fall on your knees and admit that you don't have a just claim to it, and then I will have mercy on you.
Jacob, the perspective that you're advocating here, it's set off fireworks in my mind, realizing what has happened to the ideological stream within society, because Christians started getting this wrong, and they started thinking that God is an altruist. And this happened a couple hundred years ago. And it became the way that we think about morality as such. We became altruists as such. And then to the point where even people that are not Christians, like Oprah Winfrey, she's definitely accepted collectivism and altruism and even mysticism and blind faith and stuff like that as her theory of knowledge. And so then she goes back and she looks at the God of the Bible, and she's not a Christian, but she looks at the God of the Bible, and he's jealous and he's vengeful and he has wrath and he punishes his enemies and stands on their necks. And she says, I don't want to have anything to do with that because I reject that because he's not a good God, according to what the Bible says and according to my standards. The funny thing is she got those standards from Christians that didn't understand the Bible and that were twisting it. And now we're in the place, the new Christian intellectuals are in the place of saying, hey, the current Christian intellectuals are a deviation. We need to go back to the way the old Christians thought about it. We need to go back to the way John the Baptist thought about it when he says that the axe is laid to the root of the tree. I mean, we've got to be able to understand that God is not moral according to Oprah's morality.
But and according to many contemporary Christians' morality. According to
right.
Tim Keller's theory of justice, God is not moral.
But for some reason, the atheists, like Richard Dawkins, who critique God and call him a moral monster, they actually understand more about what the Bible says about who God is than a lot of Christians. They just have a different standard, and they're not willing to make the Bible their standard. So, I mean, that's a remarkable turn of events, and we're trying to cast the light on that and help you see the intellectual landscape and just how far we've come. So, Jacob, let's make a pivot here. A lot of people have put in comments, and we may start referencing those, and I might just read them for time's sake. But I also thought we should pivot towards some practical application. We've laid out a lot of theory. Let's talk about some instances of how collectivism and the related moral code of altruism have seeped into the public discourse today within the church and within broader society. Name an example, or if you want, I can.
We mentioned a couple at the opening of the episode here, but some that we didn't mention are public schools. The idea that everyone deserves an education, whether that's through public primary school or through the school loan racket that is currently causing major bubbles. A lot of Democratic candidates are talking about forgiving student loans and things like that. There's healthcare. The Affordable Care Act was very collectivistic. It was very much based on this idea of needs constituting a right, that everybody has a right to healthcare. And even many conservatives are starting to use that type of language, that we have a right to healthcare, or at least they're not fighting against that language, which is what we need to be doing. There's minimum wage laws are often justified in collectivistic ways, even though they're very harmful to the people that they're supposedly trying to help. Cody, what were some that you had in mind?
I think an important one is abortion.
Yeah.
So I wanted to share with you, I saw an article the other day about a man who was butchering tens of thousands of babies over his career as an abortion doctor. And he was working in a Black community. And his goal, when you asked him why he did, he was self-righteous about it. He said, look, I'm working to help the Black community. When a child that's not predicted and not wanted comes, that makes people very inconvenienced. And I want to help the overall community in this geographical area become more wealthy. And I want to create equality so that, compare them to other demographic groups. They need to be rising up and becoming more prosperous financially. And so if we have to sacrifice children on the altar of convenience to do that, then we will. And it reminds me of the Spartans, the ancient Spartans 2,500 years ago, exposing their babies on the mountainside because they weren't strong enough and they weren't beautiful enough. And so we're only going to keep the ones that are going to help the polis and help the society as the whole. And they were thinking about it collectivistically like that. And it's terrible, because if you accept collectivism and you think about people as primarily being a group, a machine, not looking at the individuals that you're killing, you may be able to rationalize doing that.
Yeah, well, on collectivism, it makes total sense. Why not? If the primary is the unit, or is the society, if society is the unit, the group is the primary, then it makes no sense to watch out for the good of individuals if it's going to be unhelpful for the ends of society, however that's defined. That rationale, that disgusting, horrible abortion rationale, makes total sense. And we see that with that doctor, but we also see it in the recent legislator, I want to say it was in Ohio, or was it Iowa, where a legislator proposed an exemption from the heartbeat bill, I think it was, for African Americans. Basically, there was a law being proposed for restricting abortion, and she wanted to make an exemption for African Americans, which is basically saying, I want it to be legal to kill African American babies before it's legal to kill other babies. And the reasoning, the justification was for the good of the Black community. And there you're talking about the Black community in a very collectivistic, disembodied sense, where who cares about, quote unquote, the Black community if you're slaughtering individual Black people? But that's the mindset that collectivism incubates. It teaches you to think about communities disembodied and disconnected from the individuals that compose the community.
So tracing now our ideological system and framework for understanding this, we went from how there's altruism, and that suggests collectivism. And then collectivism also suggests statism, and it suggests violation of individual rights. I think you see that clearly in the example of abortion. It's both a moral issue and a legal issue. And there's one position that says that individuals have the right to their life, and that is absolute, and that is inalienable. There's another position that says individual rights are never an absolute. ERLC, Russell Moore, president, he said that. And so let's move the conversation now to the question of individual rights and see how that is the most logical implementation of this principle of individualism. Jacob, let's talk about how individual rights work. Like, what are they? What do they mean? And how does that fit into this whole conversation?
Yeah, so individual rights are really just based off the idea that we talked about earlier, that your ultimate moral obligation before God is concerning your own self, your own life. That under God, you own your life. You are the Lord of your life. Under God, that is, right? That there's no one in between you and God who is Lord over your life. No one else owns your life when we're talking about under God. Yeah, you own your life. You are the master of your life. You are responsible for your life. You're the ultimate steward. And if you're responsible for it, then you're also the owner of it. And if that's the case, then you have a right, a moral right and a moral obligation to take control of every aspect of your life. Fundamental individual rights that we talk about are the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property. And the first two might be obvious when we talk about self-ownership. Obviously, if you're dead, you don't have a right to life. Your right to life has been snuffed out, and your ability to be steward of your life is snuffed out. And if you're not free, if someone locks you up or enslaves you, that it seems kind of obvious that your moral duty to God is being infringed. But a lot of times it's difficult to conceive of how property plays into that. And I think it's helpful to think about property as an extension of your life. Because think about how property comes about. How is wealth produced? And that's the key word. It's produced. Wealth isn't, we talk about this all the time. Wealth doesn't grow on trees. Do we actually believe that as a society? Even as conservatives, do we believe that wealth isn't just sitting out there waiting to be accumulated? No, wealth is produced by individual humans. And if you go to primitive examples, think about yourself on a desert island. You've got to fashion tools to catch fish or to kill wild prey. And then you've got to build shelter for yourself. You've got to create things that are valuable to your own life and to your own survival. And when you do that, you're expending your own life. You're expending your mental effort and your mental focus. You're expending physical energy and sometimes blood and sweat and tears. And you're expending time that you could be doing something else. So you're investing yourself into the production of the material wealth that we're talking about when we talk about property. And so it literally is a concrete extension of your own life. And so for someone to steal your property, to take your property away from you, is similar to them cutting off a limb or enslaving you for a certain amount of time. And that's why property is an extension of your life, and why, if we're going to be serious about this idea of having an individual obligation before God and individualism, then we need to be serious about inalienable individual rights. And that's what we mean by it.
I looked at something the other day that said that in 1990, the average American had to work through about January 22nd to pay their taxes to the government. And now I think it's like mid-April. The proportion of our incomes that we're paying to the state has multiplied significantly. And the proportion of the economy that's controlled by the government has multiplied. And that's inconsistent with individual rights. But Jacob, let's talk about how conservatives may sometimes miss the ball on this. You see where I'm going with this?
Not quite. Why don't you give me a little bit more of a lead?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So this idea of individual rights, conservatives want to say, yes, we believe in limited government. We believe in independent judiciary. We believe in free markets, free-ish markets.
Free-ish.
But then the conservatives will say something like, but I do think that we should pass a law that says that every company needs to be willing to pay maternity leave for 6 months or whatever. That was Ivanka Trump's thing. And that was coming from conservatives. Or you see from Tucker Carlson, we should pass a law that says that you can't have robotic trucks because that would put people out of jobs. Mm-hmm. Conservatives are missing the ball here, because if you believe that individual rights are an absolute, you cannot just say, oh, well, my standard is what's best for the human condition. That cannot be your standard if individual rights is your standard. And somebody like Steve Deace, even, he said that our principle is what's best for the human condition. And I'm thinking, how is that different from what Hillary Clinton would say? She'd argue the same way. So conservatives are very often missing this. So that the alternative is something that looks more like conservatarianism or libertarianism. And I'm just trying to lay these out there because I want to show you the intellectual landscape, show you where Jacob and I lie. We do not call ourselves libertarians. If anything, I'm mostly like Ayn Rand's politics, except for she was wrong on abortion. But other than that, I like the night watchman state concept, menarchy, the libertarian-ish type ideal. Jacob, is that how you see it as well?
Yeah. So I mean, we're anti-anarchist sort of libertarians. We would disagree with the anarchists that the state is a necessary evil, or that it's an unnecessary evil even. We would say it's a necessary good because it's good to protect property rights. The fundamental issue of the government is, what is a proper use of force? And the proper use of force, if everybody has individual rights, then the proper use of force is the protection of those rights. That's the only proper use of force, because anything other than the protection of individual rights would be a violation of individual rights when we're talking about force. And so there is a proper use of systematized force in society, and that is the protection of individual rights, but strictly limited to that. And that's the principle that's the only principle that can consistently combat the progressives and the leftists and the radical socialists, because when you try to have quasi-collectivist principles like Cody mentioned with Steve Deace there, the Marxist is going to be able to say, yeah, I agree. And that's why we should be full-blown Marxists. You're compromising, dude. You're half-hearted. I agree with your principle. Let's take it to its fullest conclusion. So we need to be really careful about the principles that we're operating off of and the principles that we're stating to the rest of society, because if our principles give credence to the leftist cause, then we're undermining our cause big time.
Hopefully what we've said so far has clarified where we disagree from the radical left, but also where we disagree with the libertarians, but also where we disagree with the conservatives. So we're unicorns in a certain way, aren't we? So let's talk about one other philosophical trend that connects with this, and that would be the utilitarianism pragmatism concept. Now, this is a flexible concept. A leftist can endorse it. A conservative traditionalist can endorse it. But Jacob, can you share with us a little bit about what is utilitarianism? Spock is a utilitarian, isn't he? Like, if you watch Star Trek, I think he's generally a utilitarian, and Star Trek is generally utilitarian. But
yeah.
What is it, and why do we not agree with that either?
So, I mean, it's very much a pragmatic view of the greatest good for the greatest number is the typical slogan to describe it. And so it's how can we achieve the greatest good for the greatest number? But the question is, what is the good that you're talking about? And the same thing goes for pragmatism. When someone says conservatism is about conserving what works, well, what's your standard for what works? Works for what? You're skipping over that question, and you're either going to have a moral standard for answering that question or answering what's good, or you don't. So in a certain way, pragmatism and utilitarianism are inconsistent even with themselves. That they're sort of irrational or incomplete social philosophies, because they beg the question, they beg the moral question in a way that allows them to smuggle in moral principles without explicitly naming them. And so I think my major pushback to both would just be, hey, state your moral principle. What do you believe is the good? And so I would say the greatest good for the greatest number. Well, if the good is individual rights, then yeah, the most individual rights for the greatest number, which means don't sacrifice anybody's individual rights. And that is the greatest good for the greatest number, objectively speaking. But you've got to define your terms. You've got to state explicitly your standards, rather than just being sort of what happens is when you adopt pragmatism or utilitarianism, you've got a secret standard that you're maybe not even admitting to yourself, like wealth flowing smoothly through the economy, or family values generally being promoted among society, or the ability of middle-class people to live a decent middle-class lifestyle, or whatever it is. You've likely already got some vague, unnamed standard that you're going for, and you're just utilizing utilitarianism or pragmatism as a way to shove that through, because you know that if you explicitly stated that standard, it would be laughed at and mocked at, and rightfully so.
All right, let's land the conversation, the main presentation. We'll do some Q&A, but let's land the main presentation here with a huge, important payoff. And that is this. How are we going to use the ideas that we've just described to fight against certain trends within the church today? And I'll name some names. Thabiti Anyabwile has been advocating for race-based reparations. Or Rod Dreher calls himself a red Tory, which means that he's wrong on everything all at the same time by some miracle.
And he openly praises Elizabeth Warren's economic policies.
Yeah. Or let me name one more name, and that is Michael Haykin. Michael Haykin, who says that this idea of Marxism is just a bugbear, and it's ridiculous that we would even be concerned about that. He says that as Venezuela's lights are going out, and you can see it from space. And he says it as people on MSNBC and in Congress are repeating the exact ideas that made that happen. Don't know how he became a professor. I don't know how he calls himself a professor. This is disgraceful. And so the payoff of all the ideas that we've described so far is that we have given you a consistent way that you can fight against the ideas of Michael Haykin, Thabiti Anyabwile, and what was the other one I mentioned?
Rod Dreher.
Rod Dreher, yeah. Thoughts on that, Jacob?
Yeah, so I would just say one of the reasons that the leftist push, both in the culture and in the church, has succeeded so much is because those who are opposing it, the conservatives, loosely speaking, have not been able to oppose it on principle, the way that we've been talking about. The opposition has always conceded certain principles to the left, and most of those principles are rooted in collectivism. Most of the conservative opposition to the left, both in the culture and in the church, concedes that the many outweigh the few. They concede that the collective is more important than the individual. They concede that individual rights are never an absolute. They concede all of those things, and then they just try to negotiate and say, but let's not do this so quickly, or let's not be so radical. And that sounds like moral compromise, because it is. Like, if you believe that the goods of the many outweigh the goods of the few, and and you believe it's a moral absolute, then you are a moral compromiser if you say, well, not so fast. Like, you're the person that young people should be fighting against, because you're trying to take the middle road. You're being a pansy. You're being a coward. And that's why the youth are so passionate about leftist policies, both in the culture and in the church, because the leftists are consistent. The leftists have moral strength and moral fortitude and moral conviction on their side. And that's what young people rightfully want. That they want to be part of doing what is morally good, what is morally righteous. And that's what the roughly speaking, conservative wing needs to implement. We need to adopt, the opposition needs to adopt certain fundamental consistent principles and convictions that we can present as moral absolutes, as things to rally people around, as things to get people morally excited about, and to get up off their butts about, rather than just looking like moral compromisers who want to drag their feet as we drift more and more towards the leftist narrative.
Slow leftists is what they call them. And nobody's going to get excited about Russell Kirk's principles, so-called. Nobody's going to get excited about intellectual humility and about using the things that work from the past without having named a standard of what work even means. People can get excited about individual rights. As you can tell, Jacob and I are on fire for them. And we're going to make the resources from today available. So once you get the YouTube video and the replay, there will be a link to a Google Doc, and that Google Doc is going to have a whole bunch of recommended reading. Some things from the Objective Standard about Spock and about collectivism, and some other articles from Quillette, and a couple of articles that Jacob wrote, including the one about Haykin, christianintellectual.com/Haykin, and also /Marxism is another one that's really worth looking at in conjunction with this. So I want to respect the fact that a lot of people have put in some good thoughts in the comments. And Jacob, let's do this. For the remainder of the time, I will just go through and read the comments. And if you'd like to add anything to respond to anything or answer anything, feel free, or we could just move right forward. Thank you guys for joining on the recording today. And if you would like to be a supporter of our project, go to christianintellectual.com/Patreon. And there you can find out how you can get more resources from us. Definitely support our project. The more income that we bring from this, the less we have to work in things that we don't really feel that passionate about. So, there's just, like Jacob told me the other day, there are so many people out there that need to be silenced. Too many people and not enough Jacob. But Jacob is doing this work. So I want you to know that any donations that you give, eventually that's going to affect Jacob's ability to fight these battles. All right. So some discussion. This one's from Darren, and he says, Jacob said that the group is individuals based on agreed values. And one can leave, but if everyone leaves, then there's no group. But doesn't it mean the values simply changed? And so other people left one group of principles for another. It's not a vacuum of values that people leave one group for. Are people in our culture becoming post-Christian values? And so the Christian circle is getting smaller and less influential in government and in culture. I mean, that sounds like more of a statement than a question. But Jacob, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, so it's true that everybody can at once reject a given set of values and then adopt a separate set of values. And then the group has changed from being centered around one set of values to being centered around another set of values. But it's also true that everyone can collectively sort of reject the one set of values and then adopt completely different sets of values, or go and form disparate groups around different sets of values with smaller groups. But the point I was making is that in any group that we're talking about, the thing that's doing the uniting is going to be the ideas or the values. As long as we're talking about voluntary groups, as long as we're not talking about things where you're forced to be in the group, the extent to which it's voluntary association is the extent to which it's based on a common set of values or ideas to one extent or another.
Go ahead, Jesse, about the communitarianism of Charles Taylor and TGC's embrace of their ideology.
The idea of collectivism and individualism and the language that we see the Gospel Coalition folks using, it's always been it's shifty, right? They're very nuanced in how they talk about things. And so that's how they can avoid the charge of being Marxist or neo-Marxist or socialist. And they don't really talk about how the government, what the government's role is in their collectivism as they describe it, and their pursuit of social justice. Well, just recently, the Gospel Coalition held, I think it was a regional conference where they talked about the philosophy of Charles Taylor, and specifically his latest book called A Secular Age. And I just finished reading that. It's not all bad. It's basically a history of the world and how we got to where we are now. And one of the big concerns is keeping people engaged, keeping people in the church and reaching people in a post-Christian world and post-Christian society. And so he's a progressive communitarian, and automatically that points you to the fact that he's looking more to the community than the individual. One of the really irritating things about the Gospel Coalition and this book, they just came out with a book. It's a collection of essays kind of based on this conference. Essays written by Alan Noble, Carl Truman, Derek Rishmaway, I'm not sure if I'm saying his last name correctly, and Colin Hansen. Anyway, they use the term human flourishing, I don't know, 1,000 times in their essays, and it's annoying. But basically, this communitarianism, it begins with this idea that you don't have individual rights, right? Russell Moore talks about how individual rights are always understood in relation to other people, and that's communitarianism. And the only real individual human right that people have is this right to human flourishing. And what does that mean? Is it the right to pursue, a productive life or a successful life? No, it's that you are actually entitled to human flourishing. You're entitled to live the good life, to have those things, have healthcare, have a college education, and have all of those things. And that's really what they mean by human flourishing. So I want to mention Bruce Fronin, who writes for The Imaginative Conservative. He's a professor of law. He's really been at the forefront of understanding Charles Taylor and pointing out where his communitarianism is really a kind of socialism, or it leads to socialism. And Charles Taylor, specifically in Canada, he's a Canadian philosopher. He ran for office 3 times, and he did it with the basically would be the Democrat Party, the Workers' Party of Canada. And so I'm looking at all of these connections between Charles Taylor and his thought and what he gets right and what he gets wrong. And I'm looking at the Gospel Coalition and all of their stuff. And they get so many things right in the same way and wrong in the same way. Anyway, so Bruce Fronin points out that there's a difference between commitment and obligation. One of the things that Taylor says is that for people to feel like they are flourishing, they need to have a commitment to some kind of cause. And it doesn't matter really what that cause is, so long as they are committed to something. And it seems like Ligon Duncan, especially in his comment on that panel at the Shepherd's Conference, he mentioned, I don't want to lose my grandkids to the LGBTQIA ideology. So I want to give them a different commitment, a different cause to fight for. And it's as if they're pursuing this solidarity. They want to keep people in the church by giving them this commitment to human flourishing, whatever that means at the moment. And it changes throughout their life. So yeah, what I'm seeing is they're bringing in this communitarianism, this specifically progressive communitarianism, and they're able to then basically say all of these Marxist things without actually, being Marxist or having read Marxist thought. So I'd like your thoughts on that, Cody and Jacob, and if you've heard of Charles Taylor and all of that.
Thank you, Jesse. Yes, we're familiar with him, but I haven't read him in depth. But you're absolutely right that they are all studying the same sources. And it's slow leftism, and it's weak-handed, effeminate, bureaucrat-minded leftism, and it's no good.
Yeah, and there's two problems that we've mentioned already exhibited in what you just talked about. One is the pragmatic ideal of we need to try to keep people in the church, or we need to try to be attractive to the community. And the assumption there is there's no moral absolutes for how to go about doing that. So as long as we keep people in the community, that's all that matters. So that there's that sort of really disgusting pragmatism to it. But then in addition to that, the talk of human flourishing as being opposed to individual rights is just disgusting to me. Like I saw your posts about, if someone says human flourishing one more time, the chainsaw and everything. I actually like that term. I think it's a great term that we should try to win back, but we just need to challenge them. Let's define it. What does it mean to be a human and to flourish as a human? It's something different than what it means to flourish as an ant. And I think, unfortunately, they are thinking of us as human beings as ants. They're treating us as if we are insects, and to flourish is to sacrifice for the colony, mindlessly submitting your mind and your values to the arbitrary needs of others without thinking about what you're sacrificing in the process. Either these men are not careful thinkers, and I think most of them aren't on these issues, that they're great thinkers when it comes to certain theological topics, but on these issues, they're either not careful thinkers, they're very sloppy and very moronic in the way that they make these arguments, or they're malicious and they are intentionally twisting these things in a way that is just absolutely absurd, and we need to call them out on it. We need to not yield the language to them and not let them get away with this sort of sleight of hand.
They want to play judge. They want to play God. They want their cabal, their cool table, to be able to play God and to play judge.
And they want to deny you your responsibility before God to be steward over your own life.
And they think somehow it's right because their group got into a position of being able to do it. It ultimately amounts to, there's more of us than you.
Ocasio-Cortez is like, I'm up here. I'm the one that's been elected. I'm making the laws. You sit down and shut up.
Yeah, it's arrogance. It's arrogance, and we should be morally outraged, and we should say so, because they will wither under the fire of our scorn. Let's move on to a next question. This is from G.S. Muse. How have the views of individualism and collectivism played out historically? So he wants to go back before Marx, before Kant, in the ancient world or in the pre-modern times. Jacob, I'm less of a historian than I wish I were. I don't know where you are on this, but do you have any thoughts on that?
The early Catholic Church, let's say, was very collectivistic, and it got more so the later it got, the closer to the Reformation. In fact, in a lot of ways, the Reformation was reassertion of Christian individualism, especially with that Protestant doctrine that I mentioned, the priesthood of all believers. The idea was, no, we don't need the collective of the church to stand as mediator between us and God. In terms of epistemology, we don't need the church to interpret the scriptures for us. And in terms of just moral authority, we don't need the church to give us permission on how to live our lives or to absolve us from our sins. We can go directly to God through Christ for that. We don't need this collective humanistic mediator called the Roman Catholic Church. So I think that would be one really, really big relevant example for us. That there are probably lots of other examples in the secular world as well that I wouldn't be super equipped to talk about.
One example is the pyramids and the slaves that built the pyramids. That's a collectivist society.
Mm-hmm.
Another example of collectivism would be, I don't know, if you think about like the absolute monarch, King Louis XIV, and how, I am the state, that kind of arrogance that says that one person needs to control everything. So that's, there's all kinds of collectivisms that have existed throughout history.
I mean, in a lot of ways, political individualism didn't come about until the American Revolution or right around then, with English common law before that, maybe a little bit. But before that, everything was collectivism. So, I mean, it's one of the reasons it's hard to put your finger on anything is because it was all collectivism. Every government, every society up until around the time of the founding of America was very heavily collectivistic in one way or another. It was just different variants of collectivism, whether it was sort of a tribal collectivism or a statist collectivism or a kingdom collectivism. It was all just sort of different colors of the same type of thing.
Jerry added the Tower of Babel is a collectivistic endeavor. And then Bobby added, Plato was definitely strongly collectivistic.
Yeah.
He was a straight up communist, whereas Aristotle was less so. He'd be more of a traditionalist conservative, what works type of a guy.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to the next question, or this one is a comment from Bruce, and he says, collectivism began in the garden, be as gods, man lifting himself up as God. The Tower of Babel is another example that he named. And then God is an external authority, and when you remove God as the authority, the question then becomes what makes your morality any better than anyone else's morality, which the collectivist's answer is decision-making through consensus.
Mm-hmm.
Well said. And then he goes on, accountability to God produces individualism, whereas accountability to man is collectivism. Anything to add, Jacob?
Yeah, I would just say one biblical phrase to associate with collectivism that's often appropriate is fear of man, especially when we're thinking about the way that we acquiesce to the collective in our own hearts or in our own minds. A lot of times that's rooted in what the Bible calls fear of man, fear of what the collective is going to think or how the collective is going to respond, rather than fearing God, viewing yourself as standing before God individually as judge, regardless of what the collective has to say.
Bruce also added one more comment, which was that he saw collectivism playing out in the book of Revelation. No man, no woman, no child is left behind from the mark of the beast. And collectivism, he says, began in the garden and it continues to this day.
Mm.
All right, here's another comment from Darren. Culture creates pressure, and one has to address that pressure to be able to steward your life, as Jacob was talking about. Society values that rebel against God and that make demands of the individual to interfere with our freedom to live wholly over our choices to serve God is something worth thinking about. G.S. Muse earlier pointed out 97% of scientists. It's a really great example of fear of man, right?
Yep.
Let's look at some more. Bruce, it sounds like he studied Karl Marx and is able to point out the thread. So listen to these quotes. Once the earthly family is discovered to be the secret of the holy family, the former must itself be annihilated, theoretically and practically. What Marx is saying is that the parents who rebuked and chastened bad behavior were working out of God's system of righteousness. Once you discover that and you can destroy that, you can destroy the family, you can silence the voice that rebukes and chastens, and then you can liberate yourself to sin. So the heart of Marxism is silencing the voices that rebuke and that chasten bad behavior based on God's authority. It's a very, very interesting connection there. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Let's see. We've got a couple other comments that I think are really pertinent to this discussion. Let me scroll for a moment. Okay, so Jerry said, I was thinking more about examples of individualism and collectivism in the Bible. If Jesus were concerned about the many, then why did the shepherd leave the 99 alone and go and find the one lost sheep? Kind of interesting point there, I think. And then he says, if it'd been about the collective, he should have stayed and protected the 99, forgot about the one.
Bruce has a really good comment. The next one down. Accountability to God produces individualism. If Christian takes a stand against unrighteousness, it is based on God's authority as the ultimate moral authority. Yeah, so think about Martin Luther or Athanasius, Athanasius Contra Mundum. The ideal of individualism isn't that you ought to always set yourself against the rest of the world, but it's that you ought to be prepared to set yourself against the rest of the world if you need to, in order to honor God, in order to do what's right. It's the idea that let God be true, though every man a liar. Let what I am convinced is true about God be what I stand on, even if the entire world is going to salt me for it.
Some of these comments pertain to different places in the discussion that we had earlier, so we can just go through them. One of them from Patrick, he says that it's ironic that in a collectivist system, it's not really the entire society that gets to choose. It's just a small group of individuals. And they have the power over your life and your death and your quality of life. So it's kind of an impossible ideal.
Yeah.
And Darren pointed out abortion or healthcare is not a right. It actually demands that other people perform labor. And labor doesn't just grow on trees. So anyway, that's a good one. And then there's another one. Jerry is a healthcare worker, and he says that as a healthcare worker, my worst patients to treat are the ones that they come in and they assume that their healthcare is a right. They demand it from me. They treat me like their servant, slave, and so on. And sure, it's not voluntary relationship. At that point, you treat other people like they're machines.
Yeah, if you haven't read Atlas Shrugged, you really should. There's a really good line in it about that, and I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's something along the lines of, what makes you think it's safe to lie on the table of a surgeon's table, whom you have said that he owes you this surgery. If he's willing to do it, then he's probably the type of man who doesn't have much self-respect and probably hasn't put much self-discipline into it, and is probably going to botch it. And if he's not willing to do it, if he rightly, morally objects to it, then why in the world do you think it's a good thing to boss him around and claim that you have a right to his services as he tries to fix you?
Love that. Gregory Rentz pointed out the biblical teaching on the image of God demands individualism over collectivism. And I believe that you can trace that through the logic of what does it mean to be in the image of God? We're distinct from the angels, we're distinct from the animals, but we are like God in certain ways.
Mm-hmm. And we're individually like God in certain ways.
Right.
Adam is an image bearer of God, even if no one else ever existed. And that's true of every single one of us.
And he also adds here, we're not collectively the image of God. We are individually the image of God. And that is borne out in the epistles of Paul over and over. He says he wants to run the race so that he's not disqualified. And I mean, you just can't get from the Bible to collectivism. There are passages that, about we are a body. Sure, we are a collective. There's a difference between collective and collectivism. This is a good one to wrap up on. This summarizes the proper approach to those who attempt to be collectivists of the mind, those who attempt to become second-handers and sheep. So he says, it cracks me up when someone tells me I'm wrong because I disagree with a PhD theologian, because he has a PhD. Really? Like, that's your argument as a Christian? Do you realize that all of the disciples would have had middle school education compared to the PhD scholars of their time? God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. Jacob, let's wrap up. Give us a closing thought, and then I'll give a call to action.
Oh, man, that PhD comment is just infuriating. Sorry. So closing thought. Individualism fundamentally is about living your life before God, walking face to face with God throughout all of life, and endeavoring to glorify God in all of your life, taking responsibility for that. And with that responsibility comes ownership. It comes the opportunity to expand your life and to act in positive ways to make your life the best it can be, not in a worldly, fleshly sense, but in a godly, God-honoring, Christ-honoring, glorifying sense. And that's what we're called to do as Christians, and that's why we're for Christian individualism. And those who oppose individualism within the church are ultimately opposing the call on your life by God to do all of that.
Thank you, Jacob. Well, if you enjoyed watching this, I encourage you to try to get more resources from us. We're going to be doubling the amount of content that we produce per month. We're moving it from 1 hangout to 2 hangouts, probably still be on Saturdays, perhaps the first and third Saturday, or some consistent schedule. We'll keep you updated. We're going to be allowing people to come in that, they've never supported us as patrons, but we're going to be opening it up so that one of the monthly events is accessible to everyone, because we think what we're doing seems to be causing some thought, and we want to invite more people into that. If you like this, definitely subscribe on YouTube and go to christianintellectual.com, and you can get everything there, as well as our Patreon if you'd like to become a supporter. Thank you for watching this, and I ask that you would do what you can to fight this battle. This is such an important battle. And so support those who are doing it, or do it yourself. And we definitely want to be there to help you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, guys.